My name's Neal Jones. I'm the Trust's Director of Patient Safety and Human Factors, and also the organisation's Freedom to Speak Up Guardian. And what I'm going to do today is give you a relatively brief insight, mainly because we're talking about this stuff for a couple of days rather than a couple of hours, into human factors, into its ability to support us in our workspace, and its ability to try and reduce the volume of errors we see across healthcare. I'd like to say on a weekly or a monthly basis, but ultimately on a daily basis, really. So, my background is a clinical background. I originally worked in intensive care, then became an educationalist, and in 2004 was trained at British Aviation as a human factors specialist, and worked across multiple organisations over the last kind of 15, 16 years, redesigning the way that staff work to increase the reliability in the delivery of healthcare by understanding the effects of environment, tasks, equipment, workspace on their behaviour to try and reduce the likelihood of us making a mistake. And a lot of human factors really focuses on the simplification of the systems within which we work. I think, unfortunately, a typical healthcare response to patient harm is to add additional boxes to checklists, add additional paragraphs to policies, and increase complexity. And what we know from other industries is that complexity increases risk, and simplicity increases reliability. So I'm going to give you a bit of an insight into how this might work, give you some examples of different error types and how they're caused. And I'm more than happy at any point for people to kind of shout things out relatively politely. But if they say something you don't agree with, or you'd like me to explain in a different way and give you some further context relevance, then just kind of chuck your hand up or just shout. No throwing of fruit or anything like that. That's okay. So, for a starting point, I guess when we think about human factors, we're thinking about the interaction of a human being within a workspace. And I guess from an allied health professional, you're looking at this from multiple different angles. But to give you a kind of a starting point, some of you, a lot of you look a lot younger than me, but some of you may remember many, many years ago, probably about 10 in fact, you'd occasionally go to a cash point and find somebody else's bank card sticking out to them. Yeah? Some of you thinking, I've heard stories about old people having these problems, but me, I don't remember. So what used to happen with cash cards and the kind of bank pin systems across the globe is when you went to get your money, the machine would give you your cash first and then would spit the bank card out. Now you might think to yourself, well, what's the issue with that? Well, from a reliability science, the error rate with people taking the cash and leaving their card in the UK alone was around 35,000 people. Now, obviously losing your bank card is quite frustrating. So the simplification of design of the process was really just to observe the interaction of human behaviour, to consider the intrinsic and extrinsic motivators as to why you actually went to the cash machine in the first place, and to see if the process could be remodelled or remapped to increase the simplicity, but actually massively increase the reliability and therefore reduce that 35,000 number. So all they did was think about, oh, why'd you go to the cash machine? Well, you go to the cash machine for cash. Okay. So if we change the order within which the cash and card are processed, then it's unlikely that you would take your card and leave your cash. So just by studying the design and interaction, allowed the designers to simply make that simplistic change. You go to the cash machine, you go there for your cash, you put your card in, stick in your pin. It gives you your card back before it gives you the cash. At the moment, we're seeing about 4,000 to 5,000 people taking the card and leaving the cash a year. But compare that to 35,000 people taking the cash and leaving the card, I think you'll agree that's a massive improvement from an incredibly simplistic intervention, just to understand those drivers and motivators. And that's really underpinning the science of human factors, in studying human response and behaviour, identifying what elements of the design functionality trigger or stimulate those responses, and then mapping back to create a system that elicits or drives a wanted response, a desired response. And it's fair to say that as we're becoming surrounded with more and more technology that's supposed to be supportive and make our lives easier, and I say that with a slight hint of anxiety, because those of you that are utilising pens and the various other systems you've brought into place, I guess if I asked you, is it easier, faster, quicker, less frustrating than having pieces of paper? I don't think there'd be many people in the room that would put their hand up and say your lives are actually easier at this point in time. And take that away from the device hardware and the Wi-Fi issues and all those other things that create the conditions within which your anxiety levels start to increase. And then you have to look to optimise your performance because of the limited time you have to undertake a task. And that's where we start to see blurring in the edges in regards to task performance. So, human factors in a clinical context, and it is a real science. You can go to university, do a degree, and masters, a PhD in it. It's been around for a long, long time. Is looking at how we can enhance your performance by understanding the effects of tasks, environment, teamwork, and the culture within which we work, and how by understanding that and reapplying those lessons, we can increase reliability to the tasks and the safety for our patients. If you're wondering how big an issue this is, for a long time now, other industries have utilised human factors as their core safety improvement methodology. Whether it's aviation, nuclear fuels, whether it's transport, it doesn't matter what it is, people utilise this understanding to improve the reliability of the systems that they operate. And to give you some idea, if we're talking about aviation and we're talking about a company like British Airways, the probability of you coming to harm, anybody flying this week? No. At the moment is around 1 in 18 million. Okay? Which means that you, your children, their children, their children, their children could fly every single day of their lives and never be in a position within which they statistically come to any harm. In a bit, we look at the probability of coming to harm in an NHS hospital in 2018. So hang on to 1 in 18 million in the back of your minds, because it might start to give you a little bit of an eye-watering sense about how unreliable the systems and processes within which the NHS has built over the last couple of decades. Human factors isn't necessarily new, although it is very new to healthcare. We're talking about a science that's got around 60 years under its belt now in improving outcomes across multiple industries. I'm guessing for many of you, you first heard the term human factors within the last 3, 5, when you looked at the agenda before you came in today. So healthcare has struggled in its kind of adoption of this and struggled to understand how it can apply it to healthcare. And it's understandable, I guess, because for other industries, they typically have a human-to-machine interface. So if you drive a car or you fly a plane or you operate machinery in a factory, it's you to a machine. Machines are reliable, they're standardised, they can be designed in a way that has a perfect repetition cycle. In healthcare, we typically work in a human-to-machine to human interface. And unfortunately, all the patients aren't the same. Different ages, different underlying comorbidities, which means that each time we undertake an intervention, whether it's a prescribing of a medication or a physical task, you cannot with absolute certainty identify what the outcome is going to be. We can utilise probability based upon past experience, but we can never be absolutely sure. So the sheer complexity within healthcare, when you think about the variability across patients, it would absolutely be impossible, and certainly a retrograde step in regards to quality, if we went down the route of creating an SOP, so a single route algorithm, that was applied to every single patient for every condition that we had. Because it might work for 15 or 20% of them to give them an optimised output, but for the rest of the people, they wouldn't fit into that perfect model. So we have complexity within healthcare that makes it challenging to apply this science. But that doesn't mean we certainly shouldn't try. So the background in healthcare is we're as far away as 1957, when people started writing journal articles about the importance of kind of utilising this stuff. We then had to wait till 2008 until Sir Liam Donaldson, who was then the Chief Medical Officer, put in his annual report that every healthcare professional should be trained in human factors. But we actually had to wait until November 2013 before the NMC, GMC, CQC, NHSLA, every regulatory and commissioning body signed up to the Human Factors Concordat in our left-hand document, stating that from that point onwards, healthcare would be redesigned based upon these principles. We then sadly had to wait till 2015 until we had the National Safety Standards for Invasive Procedures to actually have a tangible framework to deliver against in regards to each and every invasive procedure undertaken in either an acute or a primary care provider had to have a human factors map against it, including the training of the staff involved. So for an organisation like the Royal Liverpool, with the exception of peripheral cannulation and urethral catheterisation, you're talking about 680 different invasive procedures undertaken in a typical year. We then had Health Education England coming out with improving safety through education and training, where they stated that every single healthcare professional across the entire NHS has to be trained annually in human factors and assessed as part of their appraisal or revalidation as to their ability to implement it effectively within their clinical practice. Now, all of these things are incredibly ambitious because of one very simple reason. How many human factors specialists do you think are currently employed across the NHS? $50? 25? 10? 5? I'm aware of 4. Okay? So, for a system-wide transformation, there needs to be a real effort on building capability and capacity across the system before really this is going to get a real hold. And for the Royal Liverpool Hospital, the organisation was brave enough to invest in me in December 2016, and also the board was brave enough to sign off a 3-year improvement strategy, changing the way that we work and the way that we feel coming to work. Because the psychological safety and protection of staff, to create a just culture within which learning from past episodes of harm to create reliability is absolutely critical to the science that we talk about. So, starting off with culture, a just learning culture is a culture within which we can't abdicate you for all accountability when things go wrong, but we do recognise that human beings are fallible, that mistakes are inevitable, and that there is a massive difference between reckless and willfully negligent behaviour and human beings having a momentary lapse in stressful environments within which they are heavily fatigued and have no intent to cause harm. At the moment, it's fair to say that we're on a journey. And if I was asked for a show of hands in the room, for those of you that if you happen to realise tomorrow, back in your own workplace, that you've made a mistake that led to significant patient harm, how many of you would think, actually that's okay, because I recognise that I'm safe, that I recognise that the organisation's focus is going to be on learning, they're going to treat me as a second victim in this case, and I'm going to be supported both for my psychological health and also to ensure that I understand why it happened and what I would do differently so I can share those lessons with my colleagues. How many of you, from show of hands, think we're there now? Excellent. Okay. Got to start somewhere. Okay. And I think the historical attitude of a lot of NHS organisations was almost that when something goes wrong, it was because of the person, and that by removing the individual, you remove the risk. And actually what human factors science really does start to demonstrate is that error is multifactorial in nature, that our behaviours are driven by the systems and environments within which we work, and that by removing the individual, but not actually addressing the effectors of the behaviour in the first place, The conditions that created the error remain, and it's just a matter of time before some poor, unlucky person ends up in exactly the same situation and makes the same mistake. So from a reliability perspective, the punitive measures taken against healthcare professionals, and don't get me wrong, I do appreciate that there are the odd insane, there's the odd person out there that has come to work with the intent of causing harm. Harold Shippens and Bentley Alex, and there's a chap in Germany who's been relatively popular on the news over the last 6 months. Have you heard about this chap? So he originally went to prison in late 2015 and identified he came to work in his A&E department in Germany and intentionally injected 2 patients with a drug to stop the heart because in his own statement in court he was bored and enjoyed the thrill of resuscitation. In October of last year, they published that so far they've counted 110 patients that they believe he intentionally injected to stop their hearts, causing cardiac arrest leading to death. But that's not us. So to treat everybody who works in healthcare as if they came to work with the intention of causing harm and not work on the basis that those systems within which they worked created the conditions and that the staff and the majority of victims when incidents and errors occur isn't going to improve things. So that just open learning culture is fundamental to the improvement of safety, both your safety and the safety of your patients. We then have to consider the environments and the equipment and the processes that are wrapped around us to try and increase the reliability and try and increase the kind of our ability to deliver safe and effective healthcare. I guess there's some questions about whether or not the equipment and the environments we're provided with are as safe as they can be. And without wanting to be too controversial, I guess a reasonable starting point would be to ask, from a patient safety perspective, is it safer to be in a bay where the staff can see all of the patients at once? Or is it safer, or will it be safer, to be in the new Royal Liverpool hospitals in 20 whatever day we move, when almost all of our patients will be in their own beautiful side rooms with their en suites, but in doing so, probably no more than 2 patients at any one time will be visible to any member of staff. What are your thoughts? What anxieties do you have about managing the risks in a single occupancy side room hospital? Any? Yeah. So what kind of things might we see an increase in?
Falls.
Yeah, falls, perfect example. You can't stop what you can't see.
If you, for example, just looking at, someone can have a fall, can have a serious injury, potentially ending up in being dead.
Yeah,
That's the extreme, but possible. Often if you're in a bay, sometimes because some of the patients, for example, have a fall or they just going off medically, the other patients in the bay often will alert the nursing staff that something is going on. And they will press the buzzer, but they will actually get out and ask for the nurse or someone, whoever they will grab, to come and help that person. And if we're talking life and death, sometimes seconds matter.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've got a perfect example. So you're absolutely right, and I know you said that in extreme cases, but bear in mind an organisation like the Royal Liverpool Hospital, as the most trusts of our size, will see somewhere between, 120 to 150 falls per month. Out of those, we'll sometimes see between 3 and 6 fractured neck femurs per month, and 1 in 3 of those patients will die within the following 12 months following an inpatient neck femur from a fall. It starts to build the picture about how high a risk the environmental changes might create. You're absolutely right. When I was first qualified and was on the wards, Dorothy shouting to me that Mark was trying to climb over a bed rails was a critical safety component for me and allowed me to be much more responsive. Now we're looking towards technology, pressure sensor powered falls alarms, which are just distributed 100 across the organisation. We're also looking at sensors that sit against your skin and map not only physiological patterns, but also physical movement with gyroscopes, and look to predict within about 75% accuracy, will create an alert for the staff that the patient's thinking about standing up before they even know they're going to attempt to mobilise themselves. At the moment, about 60% of our patients are found on the floor, and they're the patients who have mobility issues, who should mobilise with assistance, but wake up in the middle of the night slightly confused and attempt to get themselves to the toilet. They haven't got the benefits that they have at home, such as familiar furniture that allows them to furniture walk, and nor will they have those benefits when they're in the silence. So the design of how we compensate for those issues, the design of how we build our hospitals and our systems to support you in delivering the safest and most effective healthcare, can't be something that we have as an afterthought. It has to be fundamental to every part of the building block. Whether it's how you do a task, whether it's the environment in which that task is undertaken, or how many physical people it takes to undertake it to reduce the physical and psychological stress and the fatigue that's placed upon you to do it. And then finally, to have a resilient workforce that's aware of the limitations of their own human performance. Because human factors kind of has two fundamental parts. It has ergonomics and it has human performance. And within the domain of human performance, things like fatigue, stress, the limitations of human perception, memory failure, all of these components create the conditions within which error can occur. And it's not intentional, it's not reckless, it's just being a human being. And the same reason that perhaps you get home from work today, open the fridge, can't find the milk, and then you find it in the cereal cupboard, and you can't understand how it ended up there, because by now it might have gone off. You don't suddenly, when you come to work, become more resistant to those type of momentary lapses and failures within your psychological performance. And I think although the general public perceive that healthcare professionals should wear a cape and have an S on their chest, and they shouldn't make mistakes, the reality is that we're no higher performing in work than we are out of work. The same type of errors that we're exposed to within our home environments we'll see elicited within our work environment. So if we change a piece of equipment for you, but don't adequately inform you and educate you on the changes and how to operate it effectively, that's no different from you borrowing a friend's car, coming to a junction, turning the indicators on and the windscreen wipers coming on. Now, you might laugh to yourself and realise that they're on the opposite sides, but if that was an infusion device, that you accidentally pressed the wrong button because your subconscious mapping suggests that the last machine did it this way, so this one's working in a similar way, that can have a catastrophic consequence. So creating an awareness across the workforce of when you're more likely or most likely to get caught out is absolutely critical. But what we can't do is ask you to compensate for the failures within the systems without in parallel redesigning those systems to support you in your workplace. So, how big a problem do we have with error in healthcare? So, you weren't very good at shouting numbers out in the last quiz. Let's see if you get any better. So, how many episodes of patient harm at all levels do you think are reported through databases in the Royal Liverpool Hospital? So last year, how many times did somebody fill in the datix to say that they'd made a mistake? Either they'd forgotten to do something they should have, or they'd done something that they shouldn't have. How many times do you think?
500.
500? Okay, we'll start with 500. Have you got higher than 500? Higher? Go on. 8,000? Have you got higher than 8,000? Okay. So, for the Royal, and I must frame this for you, although the literature suggests that self-reporting systems like Datix only actually capture somewhere between 17 to 20% of the actual number of errors that occur, primarily because if you work in an organisation within which you think you're going to be punished if you report something, then it doesn't take a lot of imagination to recognise that if a small level error occurs that nobody might ever realise, people might not all be as conscientious as we all are, of course, in filling in those forms and recognising those errors. So for the Royal last year, there was 16,876 incidents for the patients. Of those, 444 of those incidents were significant harm. So for every 37 datics completed, one of those datics had significant harm to the patient. Whether it was a fractured neck of femur, whether it was an acute kidney injury from somebody not checking antibiotic levels appropriately and continuing on a dose that was too high. They cover an entire plethora of error types. If you're a patient in the NHS, at the moment, and bear in mind if you're flying on your British Airways flight, you're 1 in 18 million, the NHS currently has a probability harm rate of 1 in 10. So 1 in 10 patients walking through the doors of any acute trust is likely to come to some degree of harm or receive some element of either unintended or unexpected care. Globally, it doesn't really get any better. So when you look at the models of statistical likelihood of death from an interaction with a particular activity, you can see that healthcare sits as, in regards to overall losses of life, the most hazardous activity you can undertake on the planet today. Okay? You know, deep sea fishing in the Arctic might be more high risk in regards to how many interventions to how many deaths, but in regards to the total losses of life. And in the UK, this is the first year we've really started measuring this from the Learning from Deaths reviews that started earlier this year. But America started a couple of years ago, and America have published this year their medical error data. And this starts to give you some insight into how we might look. I hope we don't, but there's always a chance. In that medical error is now classed as the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States of America. So, for me, if we know that 80% of the errors that occur have some component that makes them attributable to human factors, then it makes perfect sense that we should be embracing and learning from this science to improve our ability to keep ourselves and our patients safe each and every day. So, there's 2 main component parts in human factors. There's the design of the place within which we work, and there's the people who work within it. And within the design, you can include all sorts of things, including policies, protocols, the pieces of kit we work with, the IT systems, as well as the actual overarching building environment. And the distinction is typically convenient. I review errors not just in this hospital, but across the country and sometimes further afield, as favours to other organisations when catastrophic things happen. And I've never come across in the literally thousands of incidents that I've reviewed and reconstructed an individual who came to work and caused harm without it being driven by an ineffective system that gave them the impression that what they were doing was reasonable given the conditions within which they were working. And you probably are familiar with some of the high-profile legal cases, especially maybe a very recent case that went to High Court to have a decision turned over a young doctor called Dr. Balgardner, who was struck off the GMC register and convicted of criminal manslaughter following inability to recognise a septic 6-year-old. The conditions that that young lady was working in meant that it was ultimately inevitable that anyone with a skill level background and experience working, trying to cover 3 different clinical departments in the absence of a consultant and the other senior registrar on a day where the IT systems crashed and blood results weren't available, would be subject to some level of performance error. And to punish to that degree offers us no learning, offers us no sensibility or solution to avoid those type of things happening again. So, very clearly, in even the most high-profile cases, you can see the system failings, the conditions created that create the inevitability of the human failure, which then leads to the patient harm. And as wonderful as you all are, unfortunately you all are fallible. You all are going to make mistakes. I've made, so I'm aware of 2 drug outs in my clinical career. That's not why I'm now kind of talking to you. I'm still allowed to touch patients. In fact, no patients came to any harm. But the way that I was treated and made to feel as a result of those medication errors, given there was 0 harm to any patients, really sits with me. And Colin in the introduction mentioned that I'm also the Trust's freedom to speak of guardian. And probably, give or take 60% of the cases that come to me are about the treatment of staff, and often when they've been involved in incidents with the organisation, and the psychological harm that we cause our staff, many of which are medicated, suffering with depression and severe anxiety as a result of coming into work wanting to do the best thing for their patients and finding themselves in a situation within which, unbeknown to them, an error would occur. We do know that the best of people make the worst of mistakes. There's no real way around that. Errors are shaped by the upstream systems within which we work, and I'll give you lots of examples in a moment. And we can utilise systems like Datix to recognise patterns and errors and failures and try and learn from that by changing the way that we work to try and protect our patients. So I mentioned earlier that an organisation of this size typically has 120 to 160 falls per month, that we ordinarily have somewhere between, certainly for the last 3 years, between 2, maybe 3, up to 6 falls that lead to fractured neck and femur or kind of serious head injuries every month. We've done a massive amount of work on falls prevention over the last 6 months. And I know this is going to be the kiss of death, but we haven't had a fall that's led to harm in this organisation for 57 days. That's the longest this organisation in history has ever lasted, by changing the way that we manage falls, the way that we approach patients who've got risks of falls. So our current statistical probability of coming to harm from a fall in this organisation is 50% lower at this point in 2018-19 than we finished 17-18. So even simplistic measures to support staff in doing the simple things can have a significant improvement and reduce the likelihood of harm to patients, and the evidence shows that unequivocally. There's a chap called James Reason, who's the kind of the godfather of human factors from Manchester University's Professor Emeritus, and he says very famously, you can't change the human condition, so you can't suddenly make you all wonderful and immune to error. But what you can do is change the conditions within which humans work, and by doing so, reduce the likelihood of people making mistakes. So if we can apply those same lessons, going from 35,000 people leaving the card to only 5,000 people leaving the cash, if we can make that type of impact by redesigning our healthcare systems to reduce the likelihood of error, then we're going to start to see that 1 in 10 go up to 1 in 100, maybe even 1 in 1,000. Don't think we're going to get to 1 in 18 million anytime soon. Just to give you a quick example, the type of error you might see or kind of hear about. A member of staff using one of our infusion pumps is meant to administer a bag of fluid over 8 hours at 125 mils per hour. For some reason, somebody spots that they've actually entered 785 mils per hour into the pump. What's going through your mind right now? Have they been careless? Have they been reckless? Is it a training issue and a competency issue?
The equipment shouldn't allow you to make such a mistake of that. It's like a field-safe thing, like for us dietitians, like they brought in like enteral food syringes that years ago used to be compatible with IV connections and things, and now you can't. They aren't compatible, so you can't make that mistake. So it's sort of stopped.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sort of thing from happening.
Yeah, brilliant. So I guess the question is, we should be engineering out the design flaws that we know cause people to misinterpret interface and create these mistakes, but actually when you look at the equipment that we're provided with, can anybody spot why an error like that might happen? And the person who makes it might not even realise they've made it. Yeah. So the lack of, perfect. So the keypads are inverted due to a lack of standardisation in medical devices, meaning you could have two pumps next to each other. What you probably recognise if you've had your back, again, back to cash cards, and I'm not trying to get your PIN numbers out, so this isn't some kind of Darren Brown mind control experiment. If you've had your PIN number for a while, you start to follow a pattern as much as you do look at the numbers. And that's the way that we operate. We use something called heuristics, which is mental shortcuts that allow us to optimise our performance in almost any given situation. So in this situation, having used the pump on the right-hand side for many years, you subconsciously know that left, middle, down is 125 mils an hour. When you're presented with some new technology that looks similar enough that you don't necessarily recognise the inversion of the keypads, it's incredibly easy to accidentally hit 785 press start and not even know you've done it. And there are examples across every NHS organisation in almost every piece of equipment where you can spot a certain design flaw that will naturally increase the likelihood of somebody misinterpreting and making a mistake. And as you say, we shouldn't have this. This shouldn't be part of the systems we're provided with. This should be regulated, and we should have safe, reliable systems. The good news is that the document on the right-hand side from the Medical Health Regulatory Authority has created a set of human factors and usability standards, which means that the pumps you just seen won't be allowed to be sold in healthcare anymore. Modern infusion devices won't even have numerical keypads. They'll just have up and down arrows for your tens, hundreds, units, etc., to reduce the potential that anybody could make that mistake. The other document which is incredibly important is the Just Culture Framework, which is going to support us in transforming our organisations into one within which you feel psychologically safe. And it asks questions such as, did the member of staff depart from policy? Ever heard that before on some videos, right? Yeah. It then says, was the policy accessible? Anybody played the game on EQMS of try and find a policy? Yeah? Okay, so we might have some mitigation at that stage. Is the policy intelligible? Well, they're quite big, aren't they? So how many people in patient-facing decision-making contexts first thing thinks to themselves, well, I know, I've got 45 minutes to print out the policy and sit and read it. That's perfectly reasonable. So is it practical? And is it in use, common use, by your colleagues in the same situation? Hands up if you've ever seen somebody when they need to make a clinical decision, go and print out a policy and sit and read it to inform themselves of what the right thing to do is. Anybody? No? Okay. So the Just Culture Framework is based upon James Reason's culpability model, and it looks at things very, very differently in regards to how we make a decision about whether or not somebody's reckless or malicious or negligent, or whether or not, which 99.9999% of you will fall into, is our second victim framework within which you get supported. That we recognise that there's errors within the organisation systems and that we need to support you because we've put you in that position. And when you look at what causes error in healthcare, although this might feel a little bit counterintuitive, there is this concept of normal failure. So no matter how good you are, even the best of the best make mistakes. Does anybody have any idea, for consultant radiologists, what the lowest ever recorded error rate for reviewing CT scans was out of 100? So the lowest number of errors any consultants ever made on the planet during trial.
20%.
It's not quite that high, it's about 3. Yeah, but it depends on the type of imaging. It does go as high as 37% with certain types of complex imaging. So even for a cross-sectional chest image, the lowest ever recorded human error rate was 3 in 100. So that's to miss a significant finding. So until we get artificial intelligence that's actually by pixel analysing this stuff for us, When humans are in the system, there's always an error, whether it's a prescribing error, whether it's an assessment error, an interpretation error, and you cannot avoid that. So even the highest reliability design in the world is never going to completely eliminate or eradicate any particular error type. We can certainly get it a lot better than 1 in 10. The technology we've looked at in regards to interfaces, the fact that serious adverse incidents are reduced with less failures. James Reason again talks about the fact that this is like a model of Swiss cheese. You can pick up a piece of Swiss cheese, it's holes all over the place, you turn it around, and very rarely or occasionally will you see daylight flowing through from left to right. And he says that the typical error pots, the small lesser failures that might contribute towards us making a mistake, are always there. But often those holes don't line up. But a day will come, for whatever reason, just bad luck I guess, where the failures in the system will align, allowing a perfect storm of errors from one person to the next, meaning the last person in the chain will find themselves in a position within which they will certainly feel as if they've accidentally caused harm to this patient. The errors themselves fall into 2 categories, latent and active. And latent conditions are almost the design of the environment within which we work. I had a case, and I sometimes get phone calls, and I won't name the organisation, but it wasn't here, where I got a phone call saying, I wonder if you could help us, Neal, something really bad's happened. I said, okay, well, what's happened? Well, we had a patient on ITU, acute asthmatic patient. We managed to wean them off the ventilator and send them down to the ward. And what sometimes happens with patients that have been ventilated for extended periods of time is they appear to be doing okay just on a normal face mask, but then after a little bit, they might just deteriorate again and require a further period of ventilation. And that's not totally out of the ordinary. So the patients have gone to the ward, deteriorated, and they required re-intubating, breathing tube putting back in and taking back to ITU. So I said, okay, so what's the problem? He said, well, the intensive care doctor and the skilled assistant went down to the ward. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning by the time they got there. They intubated the patient, but accidentally connected the patient to medical air, not to oxygen. So they pre-oxygenated with medical air. They were then ventilating with medical air. The patient's saturations were dropping into the high 50s, low 40s on the cusp of hypoxic brain injury. And the patient's now on intensive care, probably going to be 7 to 9 days ventilated before we can wake them up and identify what the extent of the hypoxic brain injury is going to be. So, okay, well, we have got a problem. So the first thing I always do is I go to the organisation within which the error occurred and ask for access to the data system. And what I really want to do is I want to look back a period of about 5 years to understand how frequently somebody's accidentally connected the oxygen tubing to medical air, to give myself a sense about the reliability of the system. How many times in this organisation, in that organisation, do you think somebody at Datix accidentally connected the oxygen tubing to medical air in 5 years? 56 occasions. What has been done about it? Nothing, because it had never led to harm before. So it sat in the no harm category, near miss. I then thought, well, I'll walk up to the ward and see how these things happen. So I stood at the head of the bed where the anaesthetist would stand. My AHP would be to my left to provide cricoid pressure, and look right, where's the flow meters? Look to my right, and there's the oxygen and air next to each other, but they were identical, visually identical. So I thought, well, at this point, because I don't work here, I've come down from a different department, I haven't had time to kind of learn through trial and error, the closest one to me is this one, and the furthest one is this one. I actually am left with a 50-50 chance of getting connected to the right one. So I thought, well, how are you supposed to tell? So if you walk around and look at them head on the end of the rotometers was the words oxygen and air with black triangles which differentiated them. But from stood here, you can't tell. So I then thought, well, I'm in a bay, I'm not going to intubate a patient with the curtains open. So I pulled the curtains round. The curtains then actually cut the 2 flow meters in half, leaving me with only the medical air flow meter in my visual workspace. So therefore, the probability of me attaching the tubing to the medical air was as close as you can get to 100%. I then went through what goes through your mind when you connect. So you connect your tubing, you turn the flow meter, it spins up to 15 litres, the ball spins, you hear the hits. The bag inflates and you start to squeeze. Every trigger that tells me I'm doing the right thing and have the right thing was there. Thankfully, in this case, the anaesthetist and ODP, after a few minutes, figured out what was happening, changed it over to the oxygen, re-oxygenated the patient, and when they woke the patient up 7 or 8 days later, there was no harm to the patient whatsoever. But as a result, the entire oxygen system was changed, the delivery system, medical air was no longer wall-mounted, it was now from compressors. Everything was changed to avoid that ever happening again. So the 56th near miss is the last miss that organisation will ever have, because it is now impossible to make that mistake in that organisation. That's the latent conditions, the conditions that are built into the organisation that you work, that because you've always worked there, nobody had even noticed that that was the case, and that gave the opportunity for error to occur. The active failures are the things that we do, the bits at the sharp end. So from a doctor and nursing perspective, sometimes you see a doctor making a prescribing error and then the nurse administering it. And you could say that the active failure was the misinterpretation of the right drug or the right dose or the misselection within the prescribing system. But also the inability for the nurse to have the depth of knowledge to recognise the error within the dosaging, etc. So the systems that we design and work in, compared to the actual human performance elements and our lack of ability to track and catch the errors, constitute the two main component parts. When you see unsafe acts, they typically fall into two categories: intended actions and unintended actions. Now, I guess it feels fundamentally difficult to wrangle with the sense that somebody might intentionally be unsafe. But actually, I want you to leave that kind of concept behind and think more about violations. Violations are typically routine and reasoned. And that means that they actually have become our custom and practice. It's how the majority of people operate. So, how many medications do you think an organisation of our size would give off licence? It's over 100. So there's 100 medicines that aren't actually licensed for particular use they're administered for. However, they are well known to be highly effective. They give the patient the highest quality and best possible treatment, and are therefore routine and reasoned. Things like the use of aminophylline for acute asthmatics. Aminophylline and theophylline are taken out of the guidelines, but there's such a highly effective medicine for acute asthmatic treatment that the majority of respiratory and emergency physicians will still utilise them. That doesn't mean that they're reckless or malicious. It means they're using their clinical expertise to optimise the treatment for the patient and give them the highest chance of successful outcome. So we have to very clearly differentiate between violations, because 90-odd, almost everyone that I see is an optimising violation to improve quality. It's not reckless or malicious in any way. Then we see mistakes, typically rule-based or knowledge-based. So I guess all of you went to mandatory training at some point. You've all attended basic life support at some point. Yeah. So at some point somebody will have talked to you about management of anaphylaxis, and have said to you that unless you have an anaesthetist or intensivist, that somebody needs to grab the intramuscular dose. So therefore, at the forefront of your mind, on the tip of your tongue, you'll be able to tell me exactly, at the drop of a hat, what the right strength, volume, and repetition cycle is for intramuscular adrenaline with anaphylaxis. I've asked probably 10,000 clinical staff this question over the last 10 years, including rooms full of consultants. Do you know how many people have been able to confidently tell me the answer? 3, 2 of those actually trained people in how you manage anaphylaxis. So this expectation that human beings can recall from memory at will, even in stressful environments, everything they've ever been taught or told, is fundamentally flawed. It just doesn't work like that. Typically the team will start saying, well, adrenaline, is it 1 in 1,000? Well, it is. Is it a mil? No, that's cardiac arrest dose. And people start merging memories associated with the wording from past experience and what they've seen. I did a study on the management of anaphylaxis and the administration of adrenaline over 2 years and found that 49.7% of the teams that I studied administered a 10 times overdose. Very, very simple error traps, very, very simple error causation. We cannot utilise human memory because it's too fallible. We need things like SOPs, algorithms, visual clues, make it easier, simpler, much more difficult to go wrong. Unintended actions, lapses, whether it's a skill-based failure or a memory failure. We all know that there's a mass degradation of skills post-training. And actually, on a more practical level, this ordinarily looks like this. So you go off somewhere, somebody trains you, they then assess you against policy or protocol, they know you're absolutely perfect, and then you go back to your own clinical team, and for many different skills you have to be signed off, so observed a certain number of times. You then say to your colleague, you mind just observing me while I do this skill. Your colleague says, not at all. As you start the skill, your colleague goes, oh, now I know you tell you to do it like that in a classroom, but if you do this, this and this, it just makes it a little bit easier. So even in the first couple of days post-skills acquisition, we're starting to learn optimisations of the skills, starting to learn to do things in different ways, starting to learn the custom and practice of the organisation within which we work. We then notice slips and attentional failures, probably the highest causation of error within any industry, and certainly within healthcare it's the most prevalent. Because what we're really talking about here is distraction. I perceive that it's tantamount to impossible to walk into a busy clinical environment and have more than 1 to 2 minutes doing anything before somebody comes up to you and goes, oh, can I just ask you, you've got a second, would you mind, can I just... It doesn't matter how high risk the procedure is, somebody putting in a central line into somebody's subclavian vein in intensive care, you still see a little face at a window, followed by a knock on the door, followed by I'm really sorry. And even tactics and strategies we've utilised, such as tab art that say, do not disturb me, I'm doing something really important, actually all that does is increase the length of the distraction because people are just a bit more polite about doing it. So they'll now still distract you, but they'll go, I'm really sorry, can I just say, I know I'm not supposed to, can I just ask me about a minute, could you do this? So combating distraction, if we could do that, would have a phenomenal effect upon the error rate within healthcare, because distraction leads to a total loss of attentional control, and then errors become incredibly prevalent within that small space. All it means really is if you're approaching somebody and they're doing something, you need to stop and say to yourself, actually, can this wait 60 seconds till they've got a natural break in what they're doing? Probably can. How many things do you actually have to tell somebody there and then and interrupt their task to do so? Very few, I would imagine. And then my favourite conversation that I have with trust boards when they ask me to go in and talk to them about this stuff is they say, well, come on, Neal, these people are really intelligent, been to university, they've got qualifications, they come to our organisation, they do the induction, they read all of our policies. I struggle with that bit. Why is it they don't just do things the way they're trained, do it right first time and then every time? And actually, that's a really interesting point. If people are highly trained enough to know exactly what good looks like, why is it that people don't do it the same way every time? Why don't we have that? So I say to them, did you drive here today? And they say, yeah. I said, what speed did you drive here? Well, I don't see why that's got anything to do with it. But actually, it's incredibly important, because trying to understand why human beings struggle to sit in that perfect space of doing the right thing every time. Probably one of the most simplistic examples is utilising driving. So I'm guessing each and every one of you, I hope, know that the legal speed limit on a British motorway is 70 miles an hour. Yeah? You might see it as you fly past it, but you know that it's 70 miles an hour. Yeah. Would you agree that if we took the average speed of every car on the motorway, within which there was no roadwork, so the driver could choose to regulate their speed at what they thought was the optimal position, that we'd probably find the average speed in the UK right now at this point is around 77? Yeah, there's obviously a lot of people going faster, some people going slower, but at 77, everybody reasonably happy with that? Yeah. So how do we get to 77? Well, it might be, with everyone, a lot of people doing 80, 85, but when you do 70, it feels like someone's going to come on your backside. So actually doing 77 feels like a bit of a balanced position. You might also notice when you get to 77, the majority of people still fly past you, so you're still the safe one. You may even have been told the urban myth that there's a 10% inaccuracy within your speedometer. So the police won't bother you until you get over 77, so it's a nice, happy, safe place to sit. It is an urban myth. There's no truth to that whatsoever. Okay. You drive at 77 for a couple of weeks, couple of months, nothing bad happens, you get to where you go a little bit sooner, everything seems fine, all the dangerous people are flying past you. It creates a normalisation of behaviour. You then have a day where you're slightly late, your right foot becomes heavier, slightly heavier, you move to 85, nobody's going to crash into the back of you, just loads of people are still flying past you, you get to where you're going perfectly, you watch an episode of Top Gear where Jeremy Clarkson tells you the speed limits on British motorways are a nonsense, based upon braking distances from 1950s, and therefore it's actually safer to drive faster and you see lower accident rates on the German autobahn. All of these influencing factors, not least the people up your backside staring at you when you're trying to do the speed limit as if you don't know what's going on here in your house, and you need to learn to drive like the rest of us, all change and normalise our behaviour. If you've ever changed the hospital or the department within which you work, you might recognise this sensation for the first couple of days or weeks, thinking, we didn't do it like that, I'm not sure I like that. Within a month, you'll be doing it the same way and you won't have even realised. And that's how the normalisation of that risk migration and transgression process affects behaviour. If your peers are behaving in a certain way, it's fair to say that within a relatively short period of time, you'll have normalised and accepted that risk, and that's why we have custom and practice. We know what the policy says, but the reality is, if you walked around any organisation and observed how people are actually performing, you'd see a normalised position that would be slightly outside the policy or protocol, but you'd be able to see instantly why people perceive that was a faster or more efficient or safer or clever or better way of doing things. When we looked at the piece of Swiss cheese and those small holes that didn't often align, those deviations in the way that we learn to perform are the holes in the cheese. It's the way we do business typically. The reality is that the greater we increase our human performance, the greater the risk of incident or accident occurs. Now, given the pressures and stresses we're facing in the NHS with the increase in activity and pressures and targets and all of those things, the changes in the way that people operate is a natural part of compensating within that process. And we've almost got to the point within which we normalise error. And at last year's Patient Safety Congress, there was one of the great and the good from NHSE's Patient Safety Domain, who suggested that we're nearing the point within which the majority of us have to live in the 85 miles per hour zone to actually get the job done and physically get home to our families at night. So the prevalence of error is directly linked to the pace, speed, stress within which you have to work. And to deliver those tasks, you have to optimise your performance in a certain way. The question, I guess, at this point is, it would be ridiculous to suggest that everybody suddenly stops and delivers their role perfectly aligned to policy, because there physically aren't enough hours in the day to do that. What we really need to be doing is putting policy closer to performance so people don't feel as if the expectations around them are unreasonable, unrealistic and impossible to achieve, and create safety support strands. Looking now just for 20 minutes on the human performance elements, fatigue, stress, situational awareness, which is around your brain's ability to accurately receive information within your environments, cognitive bias, which is how we're influenced and affected, our own set of intrinsic values and beliefs, and how they change the way we receive the information, and attentional control. All of these have a significant impact upon whether or not you're going to make a mistake in any given day in work. And the interesting part, I guess, is that other industries heavily regulate around these areas. So even on building sites now, are you hungry? Are you angry? Are you running late? Are you tired? And if you are, they want to know about it because they want to understand what your job is and whether or not they need to get you to do something different that day because of the complexity of the task and therefore the risk of error. If I stood outside the front door of the hospital on any given morning and asked staff coming through, anybody hungry, angry, late or tired, do you think everybody would put their hand up? Possibly. So part of the kind of components we're kind of wrangling with is because it's such a high-pressured, tiring and stressful kind of workspace in healthcare at the moment, is we need to really work on these elements to truly understand how to improve your performance and not just the performance of the systems within which you work. So from a model of fatigue, you probably are familiar with the term circadian rhythm, so a 24-hour clock which optimises us for periods of alertness or prepares us for periods of sleep, both chemically and psychologically. So you wake up in the morning, big increase in blood pressure, secretion of testosterone, very nice and alert throughout the morning, get good coordination, reaction times. And then, even as early as tea time, our bodies start to prepare for sleep, melatonin secretion, suppresses bowel movements, etc. So there's a relatively short window in the day where the human being is optimised. The problem we have within healthcare is that we have shift workers, which means that the circadian rhythm isn't stable. It's constantly being rotated. Unfortunately, when you rotate a circadian rhythm, a bit like jet lag, in fact exactly like jet lag, it takes typically between 48 and 72 hours for a normal average human being to normalise their performance following that shift. It means that other industries, even the brother-in-law who works at Vauxhall's, where the worst he can do is overspray the inside of the car door, not to take anything away from the wonderfulness of his job. Those of you who drive Astras will have a lot to thank him for, especially if he paints it nice and neat. But he would do a week of earlies, a week of lates, a week of nights, and then have a week off. Because they know that if they do earlies and lates in the same week, that they start to see errors. They will know that if they didn't give him a decent period of time off after his nights, that they would start to see significant failures occurring. Now, if you relate that back into healthcare, there are hospitals in this region that you can finish your night on a Monday morning and be back in work at 5 p.m. the same day. Okay, I'll leave that with you. Finish your night this morning and be back in work at 5 p.m. today. Regulated industries wouldn't have you anywhere near the factory, the plane, the whatever the particular domain you work in, within 48 hours of finishing nights. The other thing is that we often see staff who work late and then go into an early, and that could happen if you're working 2 long days back to back. Typically, if you finish late, you've got a really busy day, time you get home, 10 o'clock at night, have something to eat, get into bed, possibly midnight by the time you're actually getting to sleep, you're up you have to be up at 5, 6 o'clock the next day. Just a loss of 2 to 3 hours sleep off your normal sleep pattern has the equivalent effect of 2 to 3 pints of beer on your task performance. If you are awake because you're doing an on-call, so you've been awake one day, you're on-call Tuesday, by Tuesday morning, you will be working on around 40% of your cognitive capacity. So 60% of what's in your brain will not be available to you. And yet we have people that are actively working shift rotations that keep them awake for 36 hours. There's a department in this region that the most senior consultant starts on Friday lunchtime, works Friday afternoon, Friday night, Saturday morning, Saturday lunchtime, Saturday afternoon, Saturday night, Sunday morning, and finishes at Sunday lunchtime. That's their normal programmed shift pattern. It's insane. We know that error rates for human beings are normal for the first 8 to 9 hours, so single-fold. We know that over 8 to 9 hours, they double to 14 hours, and then after 14 to 15 hours, they then triple. That's why if you drive for a living, you have to stop doing it at 9 hours, because 40% of road traffic accidents are caused by fatigue, so they can't afford people to be in an employed capacity working anywhere beyond that single-fold error rate. We need to recognise the limitations of human performance and design our shift patterns, the way we ask our staff work and how they work, to support high-functioning human beings not to give the potential for error to take place. Stress. I mean, it's not stressful working in the NHS, is it? It's one of the most relaxing and kind of therapeutic kind of professions to be in, I'm sure. And I guess this gives you some insight into how cruel stress can be. So this is the physiological response to stress. So the first thing that will happen when you have a stress response is you will lose your hearing, something called auditory exclusion. Now, I'm led to believe that working in a team situation, hearing can be quite important. Yeah. There was, following the London bombings, you can guess the chaos that ensued within the local hospitals. One patient received 32 tetanus injections in a 24-hour period. Frenzied clinical environment, everybody just becoming task-focused, shut down, completely overwhelmed. I would have liked to have thought that the patient themselves, after injection 3, might have said, can I just ask? It's really necessary. But you also have to recognise how vulnerable people are, because you're probably not aware of this, but there's a very famous air disaster where a 737 landed on Kegworth, landed on the M1 just outside Kegworth in the mid-80s, and everybody on the plane could see out of the window that the left engine was on fire. The only two people that couldn't physically see the engines were the pilot and the co-pilot. The pilot and the co-pilot worked off their training that because they could smell smoke in the cockpit and that the air conditioning system was routed just off the right-sided engine, that it must be the right-sided engine that was on fire. So, logically, they switched off the right-sided engine. They then announced to the passengers, ladies and gentlemen, just to let you know, you may have been experiencing some kind of vibrations and turbulence. We haven't a problem with the right-hand sided engine, but not to worry, we've shut it down. The plane then continued to lose height, eventually crashed into the M1, and every single survivor of that crash was asked the same question. So you could see out of the left-hand window flames and stuff, and and the pilot said, I've shut down the right-sided engine. Yeah. Did that not seem strange? Every single person without exception said, actually, no, you mentioned it at the time. He was the professional, just assumed he knew what he was doing. So, sometimes we do get ourselves into difficult situations, and people, the stress response, not being able to hear, getting our flight response, increased blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, losing our fine motor skills, loss of complex motor skills, impaired near vision, loss of depth perception, loss of peripheral vision, getting fixated, perceptual narrowing, loss of cognitive processing, increased reaction times, hypervigilance. All of these things are completely debilitating. In fact, some of the studies have done where we've tried to push people over that threshold into complete cognitive overload. What you end up seeing is very senior, experienced people just rocking on the spot, just kind of rocking and making the odd kind of utterance, but not actually able to see. And when we video captured their performance in extreme stress and then played the video footage back to them, one of the most interesting parts was that the individuals themselves had no recollection whatsoever of that period of time within which they were just stood rocking. So stress is incredibly powerful, incredibly cruel, and can completely derail your ability to think logically, to recall information from memory, and to apply your skills and your knowledge in a safe way. Situational awareness. Your brain's ability to see reality. Now, we've got 10 minutes left, so this is going to be relatively short and sweet as an insight. But not everything you see before your very eyes is real. And at its most extreme range, cognitive neuroscientists will tell you that the most information you can accurately control through your eyes is almost the equivalent of a thumbnail and an outstretched arm. And what we're doing is we're using past experience and memory to create visual imagery, which then fills in the gaps. Now, you have got some eye movement, so there is still some kind of scanning around, but there is a real ability for me to create illusions on this screen for you to see things that aren't there or to miss things that are. And that's exactly what happens to us in our clinical workspace, where information is provided to us, and as our stress increases, especially if we're slightly tired, our perceptual model narrows and narrows and narrows, allowing for things that we would ordinarily see or hear to be completely lost to us. Very, very old example from a psychology text, if you've studied psychology at any level. So, some of you will be looking at that and see an old lady's face. Some of you will be looking at that image and will see a young lady's face. And some of you will be able to switch at will between the two. Hands up if you can see just the old lady. Hands up if you can see just the young lady. Hands up if you can see both. Okay. The real crux, the real hot point of situational awareness lies in that in any healthcare team, different members will be seeing different things, thinking it's something different, and planning to do something different, all in the same space and time. Some of those people will have an accurate interpretation of the world, and if we only ever came together and shared what we saw to create absolute accuracy, things like diagnostic errors, misinterpretation errors would be a thing of the past. So if you want to know how narrow your field of vision that you can accurately control information visually is, what do you see? Okay, so that's a completely still image. If you're seeing circles that are moving, direct your eyes to a circle that moves and tell me what happens. So you haven't suddenly acquired the power of telekinesis. What you're actually experiencing is how limited your perceptual control actually is, and how little information, because what your brain's doing is taking the size, shape and colour, referring back to past experience, and it's telling your brain what normally happens when it sees this information, which is creating the illusion of movement where no movement exists. This is how we have errors of misinterpretation. There's lots of dimensions to this, which is why sometimes somebody might pick up ephedrine instead of epinephrine, or cefuroxime instead of cefataxime, because when I talked about optimizations of the brain, these heuristics earlier, we don't read entire words, we look at the first and last letter and the shape, and that means that there's lots and lots of different error traps that the limitations of our brain's ability to control reality start to pull forward. And by understanding how we can design for reliability, we can start to get across these things. The models of situational awareness sit within gathering, interpreting, and anticipating future states. So, what do we see? What does it mean? What do I expect to happen next? One of the big error traps we see within this is that you might see a patient whose heart rate's going up, blood pressure's going down, respiratory rate's climbing, they've recently had an operation, and you think to yourself, oh, I wonder if they're bleeding. And that's brilliant, because you might well be right. You then think to yourself, okay, we agree as a team, this patient might be bleeding post-operatively, well, let's go and give them some fluid. So you give them some fluid, and in your mind, your anticipated future state would be you'd see the heart rate come down, the blood pressure come up, respiratory rate stabilise. But unfortunately, what happens is when that doesn't occur, sometimes we don't stop ourselves and question whether we've missed or misinterpreted a piece of information. We just tell somebody to go and get another bag of fluid. And then we tell them to get another bag of fluid. And then we tell them to get another bag of fluid. And we keep doing the same thing, expecting a different outcome. That element of tunnel vision and fixation does contribute towards a lot of errors. So when you see something and you think, oh, I wonder if this is this, you then treat it and you expect the patient to change in a certain way. If they don't, that should be the red flag to you to think, have I missed some information or have I misinterpreted some information? It's not to say that you couldn't have volume losses that were greater than the infusion, and it might be the right thing to continue to give fluids. But certainly you need to challenge those expectations, because these are the dark holes of error within which we often find ourselves very, very tricky to get out of. Are any of you good with numbers? Yeah, you are, I can tell you. So, if you're good with numbers, you'll have no problems with this one. You fine? Can you see the error?
We've got 2 views.
You can see this. Perfect. Okay. How many people were still going up and down? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, then backwards and forwards? Yeah. Something called a confirmation bias. Our brains are pre-programmed to look for information that we already perceive to be important. And one of the things that happens is when somebody asks you to come and see a patient, they will typically already tell you what's wrong with the patient and what it is you're going to see. That creates a next set of expectations and a pattern that we look to confirm. So by me saying to you, you're good with numbers, for the majority of you, the first thing you will have done is gone up and down the numbers. You might have scanned the words, but you wouldn't have paid that much attention to them because you'd have dismissed their values because of your pre-existing perception of the value and importance of the numbers. That's no different to how we reach diagnostic errors. Somebody tells us what we're going to see, we go in to look to confirm what we already believe to be true, and in doing so, we dismiss some of the other subtle information because it doesn't fit our existing pattern. There's so many different types of errors that we understand and can do something about. Cognitive bias changes the way within which we receive and think about information. It's underpinned by our values and beliefs. I guess a quite extreme example might be if I saw somebody in the corridor tomorrow and said, oh, I had a terrible day yesterday after giving this talk. I went working really late, I was tired, I was stressed. I went to walk outside the hospital, saw somebody I knew really well from the past, and we decided to go over the road and have a few pints. Then I thought, I'll be okay to drive home. So I got in the car, as I'm going towards the Mersey Tunnel, I got pulled over, just randomly. But now there's an investigation into me, I might lose my licence, could even use my career. And I think the majority of you, because of your pre-existing values and beliefs, are probably thinking, what kind of moron gets behind the wheel of a car in 2018 after 3 pints? You know, you've got to be insane to do that. It's so insane. But if I said to you, finished a really busy day, was on, when I got in the car, I was driving towards a tunnel, I felt my work phone buzz on the passenger seat. I looked down, just grabbed it for a second, just to see who it was, if it was important from work. As I did that, the police car came alongside, pulled me over. Now, part of you will recognise that you can barely drive anywhere without coming alongside somebody who's on the phone, either using it or looking at it. Last week I was driving down the motorway and there was somebody with an iPad on a holder, on their windscreen, watching Love Island. So, the first example, an alcoholic, you probably think that's a terrible person, can't even begin to rationalise how you do that. The second one, some of you will probably recognise that in the last week you picked up your phone just to look at it when you've had a text. Some of you may have used your phones while driving because you can barely go anywhere. Although it's bad, it's still in society. But did you realise that you are 7 times more likely to create a fatality whilst using your mobile phone whilst driving than you are if you were intoxicated? So the disproportionate values and beliefs based upon those 2 examples create a bias in how we see things and how we respond and react to things. And the way that we make decisions is affected by this, the way that our brains frame information and receive information is framed by this. And then, almost finally, a real message out to you, this is a real plea, is that what we know is that in almost all organisations, for some reason, the established hierarchy, the position within which we sit within our teams, and how confident we feel on challenging our seniors, contributes heavily towards error. In almost every recorded case of wrong side surgery globally, there was somebody in the room that spotted it, but didn't know how to raise it with the surgeon that was operating, and stood there while the patient had the wrong leg removed or the wrong organ removed. Talking about patterns, that's normally 2 boiled eggs perfectly cooked. So what I would stress to you is that if you get a gut feeling, if you just think something's not quite right, please don't hesitate to just say, can I just ask, can we just reassess, can we recheck? Because the majority of time that you get that feeling that something's not right, it'll be you that will be right. And it'll be somebody else who's tired or stressed or missed a vital piece of information or misinterpreted a vital piece of information that will be wrong. And one of the biggest improvements we could make in the culture of our organisations is to create a much more effective hierarchical gradient within which all of us feel confident to speak up when we need to protect our patients. And in fact, by protecting our colleagues, we will inadvertently protect our patients at the same time. And just as a closing point, we've spent decades and decades and decades struggling with the perfection myth and the punishment myth. That if people try harder, you just pay more attention, these bad things wouldn't happen. Or if we punish somebody and put the fear of God to everybody else will stop making errors. And the reality, what we know, is that only by re-designing the systems, by improving the conditions within which you work, making it easier to do your job, are we ever going to see a reduction in harm and an improvement in patient safety. Thank you.